So this begins our ecology unit. We're going to take a look at the structure of ecosystems and just generally how they're put together a little bit. And then after we move on from this, we're going to move and look at how energy transfers through an ecosystem, and then look at how the inorganic sections of ecosystems work in terms of how is it that the matter, such as carbon and nitrogen, and a little bit about how phosphorus moves through an ecosystem as well. So today we're going to look at the biological side of things, the biotic or living side. And when we look at this, we could start with looking at an individual, but in ecosystems, we really don't focus much on individuals because that's really the focus of biology, the other parts that we've looked at. How do cells work? How do organ systems work? And how does that all come together? But we do care a lot in ecology about populations. So in populations, when we take a look at a population, we would define a population as a group of individuals, and they're all of the same species, living together at the same place and time. And the idea of them all being together gives them the ability to interact. And we can do that, and interactions, ecologically speaking, can occur in different ways. And the ones that are important, of course, are that they have the ability to either compete or cooperate and reproduce. And of course, it doesn't mean that they're doing any of those things, and it certainly doesn't mean that they're doing all of those things, but the possibility exists. Oops, I lost our other. So that's the idea of a population. They all have to be members of the same species, and they're all together at the same time, so they can interact with one another. And a community then is a group of populations that have the exact same potential to interact. So they have to be also together at the same place and time. And it's the same thing. Of course, reproduction is out of the question because they're different species, but the idea that they can interact with one another, that's a big part of what we care about in ecology. How do these organisms interact with one another? So the idea of a species actually can get quite complicated, but for our purposes, we're going to try to simplify things a little bit. We're going to say that members of the same species have the ability to reproduce with one another and have fertile offspring. That works in many cases, but this definition is problematic. So this idea of having fertile offspring and being able to reproduce, you're assuming that they are sexually reproducing. Of course, many organisms don't sexually reproduce. So there are lots of gaps in this definition. Another thing that we could say is that they have an identical evolutionary history. They all share the same most recent common ancestor. And that's a little bit more encompassing, but for our purposes right now, we're going to be thinking about it in that way with the knowledge that it's problematic. It isn't just so easy to give things labels and say that's it, and we'll see that over and over in ecosystems and when we're trying to describe them. Labels are helpful, but they usually require nuance and explanation. Same thing within a population. So in a population, It's just the idea that organisms could feasibly interact with one another. Again, it doesn't mean that they do. And you're talking about this in an ecological sense, and with our ability, especially as people, to travel more easily now than we have it in times in the past, it really forces us to re-examine what population means. Though in the classical sense, populations can become isolated from one another. And so sometimes you'll start off with one population, and there are examples of this. One of the best known examples of this are species of lizards that exist in the American Southwest. And they all started off as the same species. And over time then, as a river came by, and it's called the Colorado River, Colorado River is responsible for creating what we call the Grand Canyon, which is this extraordinarily deep chasm that served as a reproductive barrier because animals on the A side and animals on the B side no longer had exposure to one another because the Colorado River stood in their way. So essentially, these became two different populations. Okay, we have one on this side of the canyon, another population on the opposite side of the canyon. And they had different selective pressures. There's different, slightly different climates associated with the different sides of the canyon, slightly different predatory behaviors of the organisms that are preying on them. So eventually, enough reproductive barriers came into place so that they became different species. So isolation of populations can cause changes to occur. Just due to different selective pressures on those populations. The next thing we're going to look at then is how do organisms obtain their energy? And this is another one where we're going to give a label, but this is a label that's a little bit easier to work with, and that's autotroph. And auto means self. Automobile means it's something that can drive itself. It moves on its own. Autotrophs are self-feeders. They can obtain energy by using an external energy source. And it takes that external energy source provides energy to produce, to take low energy molecules such as carbon dioxide and water. And we need more than one carbon dioxide, more than water, but it gives us the ability to make glucose, something that's high in energy. So having the ability to do this is something that's unique to autotrophs. And they also, this is by far the most common kind of autotrophy, is the ability to capture sunlight. There have been other kinds that have occurred, normally by volcanic vents. There are organisms that can make use of the chemical energy coming out of volcanic vents to make their own high energy organic molecules. Same thing for deep sea vents as well. But by and large, most of the energy that's obtained, that's fixed, comes from the sun. And it converts carbon dioxide and water into glucose through the process of photosynthesis. These are organisms that make their own food. Of course, you and I do not make our own food. We are heterotrophs, which means that we obtain our energy by consuming high energy organic molecules that autotrophs made. We can do that by directly eating the plants, the autotrophs themselves, or if you eat an animal or say a fungus, then you're eating an organism that got its energy from an autotroph. And here's an example of a fungus. This is called yeast. They get their energy by secreting chemicals that break down autotrophs after they've died and then digest them. Here we have a sea star, which serves as a predator. It will eat typically shellfish and consume them. And of course, then the shellfish most likely fed on phytoplankton and zooplankton. So the phytoplankton provided the energy for that ecosystem. And we also can see here we have a buffalo and a bird on top of it. So all sorts of shapes and sizes, but the one thing that they all have in common is that they cannot make their own food. We're going to go outside and maybe make some vitamin D. We're not going to be making our own food. So we look a lot in ecology at how populations interact with one another, and one of the ways that that communities, the populations within communities can interact is through predation. So when we look at predation, what we're looking at is one organism will consume another organism and get the advantage of the energy that it has stored in it. Here we see an example of that on the right. We have salmon that are returning to where they were born to lay their own eggs, and then there are brown bears that are in the way of that. So as the salmon are returning from the ocean back to their breeding grounds, brown bears are waiting to consume them. So in predation, one organism consumes another. That's not the only way that two different populations can interact with one another. Here we see an example below of a black walnut tree. So if I take a look at this, here's our black walnut tree here. And underneath of it, there's no grass growing. And that's not by accident. That black walnut tree is secreting a chemical into the soil from its roots. And that chemical is killing any plant that is there. And in that way, the black walnut tree is competing with the grass, with the population of grasses that are around it. And in that particular case, then the black walnut tree is interacting with the grass, but it's not consuming the grass. It's just basically trying to get resources. So there's this battle for resources that makes up a lot of the competition that we see between different species. Sometimes those resources can be divided into separate niches, what we call separate areas. So when competition occurs, it may not occur necessarily head-to-head for a very long time. In other words, it's very uncommon for species to both be competing directly for the same thing at the same time all the time. For example, hawks and owls both hunt small animals. They both hunt the same kinds of small animals. But owls have adaptations, large eyes, excellent hearing, the ability to fly silently, that allows them to hunt very, very well at night. Hawks, on the other hand, have very good daytime vision, are very, very fast and very, very strong, so it allows them to work during the daytime. So they're both predators, they both prey on the same thing, but they don't directly compete head-to-head because their niche has been subdivided to two separate niches, where one is working and is really effective at night, and one is really effective during the daytime. Populations can interact in other ways as well. In those ways, we can put them together and call them symbiosis, which are these long-term sort of relationships that exist. We're going to take a look at three examples here. One is mutualism. And mutualism is a kind of relationship where both organisms benefit. We can think of it as good for one of the organisms and also good for the other organism. One of the famous examples of this is clownfish and sea anemone. Clownfish have the ability to clean the sea anemone by taking care of parasites. They can also eat some of the things that are nearby. And then when they defecate, their feces actually are food for the sea anemone. The sea anemone also has a toxin. That toxin is unpleasant to other fish that might try to eat the clownfish. But the clownfish appears to have no ill effect from the sea anemone. So it's immune to that sting. So the sea anemone provides a good home and protection for the clownfish while the clownfish is is helping to take care of the sea anemones. This is an example of mutualism where both organisms benefit. Another example would be commensalism, where one organism benefits, but there's no effect on the other organism. We can see that with the antelope and the spider right here. So the spider there has spun a pretty spectacular web that is not really helping the antelope in any way, but it's also not really hurting it. It's having no real effect on it. Whereas the spider is collecting all of the bugs that are, or some of the bugs that might come nearby, and has now an area that it can call its home, for lack of a better term. So that's an example of commensalism, where the antelope isn't really benefiting in any real material way, but the spider is. Mosquitoes themselves, whether they're parasites is debatable, but there's a plasmodium within that some mosquitoes carry that gives rise to a disease called malaria. So in this particular case, that plasmodium has a very of course, it benefits by being inside of a mosquito or inside of a person, where it can survive and thrive and reproduce, but it causes illness within humans. Okay, so in that particular way, in parasitism, we have an ecological relationship that lasts for a long time, where the plasmodium benefits, but the human is harmed by it. So usually, in most cases of malaria, the person does not die, though not always. Malaria can be fatal, but most people who get malaria survive it, and that allows the plasmodium to also survive. And that sort of reproductive strategy of a parasite not killing its host is one that tends to be pretty successful. If a parasite does kill its host effectively, or quickly, then that means that the parasite itself no longer has a home. So parasites benefit only when they don't overly harm their host. So autotrophs make their own food, but they also are essentially, we can think of those as the producers of an ecosystem. They're the thing that are making the food, or they're the things that are making the food for everybody else. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, are the things that are consuming organic molecules. So because we can't think of them as only consuming organic molecules, we call them consumers. So these are, again, different roles that they have. Now we can subdivide consumers. We have consumers that are eating living things or freshly killed things, and we can think of those as herbivores or omnivores or occasionally carnivores. The carnivores, strict carnivores, are extraordinarily rare, and virtually no carnivore is a strict carnivore. Even cats, which are very, very carnivorous, get about 30% of their calories typically from plants, so that can go up or down a little bit. Then the things that consume dead material are called decomposers, and they're crucial to an ecosystem, or else everything that died, if it didn't break down, would just accumulate and accumulate, which has happened in history. There's a period in prehistory called the carnivorous period, where plants would die and not fully decompose, and not die and fully decompose, and not die and fully decompose, or they would die and not fully decompose. And as they did this, they just accumulated and accumulated and accumulated, and over time, that's when we think of the coal deposits and the oil deposits that we tap into today. Those are sort of the focus of those. There's two different kinds, though, and it goes with how is it that they digest their food. Detritivores, we can think about things like vultures or that kind of animal, the thing that consumes the dead thing and then breaks it down within its body. Saprotrophs are things like mushrooms or other fungi or bacteria that secrete enzymes that will break down their food. So, some examples of this just might be like something like the dung beetle, where it will wrap up, dung and other small dead bits of matter into balls, and then of course consume those. That would be a detritivore, whereas a saprotroph, again, the mushroom, it's growing and thriving by releasing those enzymes from their bodies, and then by doing that, then they can obtain nutrients. So that sort of wraps up sort of our general sort of vocabulary on roles and that organisms can play in an ecosystem. And then what we're going to look at next time then is how is it that energy is used by an ecosystem, and what changes occur to that energy as it moves through the ecosystem. Okay, so look forward to talking to you soon, and take care.